Screams echoed as the tendril retracted, slick and glistening, and then more tendrils erupted from the surrounding walls that began to pulsate and breathe as if the building itself had come alive. One by one, members of the team were dragged screaming into the fleshy depths of the flat, swallowed whole by the ever-shifting architecture, the screams cutting off suddenly like a candle snuffed out by a violent breath. Holtz managed to fire a few shots into the darkness, the bullets clinking harmlessly off the wet walls as if shot into water. Desperation overtook methodical caution. The survivors retreated, dragging the injured behind them, collapsing into the street as the flat exhaled behind them, the door slamming shut with a finality that shook the building to its rotten core. Outside, emergency radios crackled with panicked calls for reinforcements and medical aid. Holtz stood in the choking fog of street lamps and flashing lights, his eyes haunted, his shoulders heavy with the knowledge that the flat was winning. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a predator. And it was hungry for more. Detective Adrian Holtz's descent was not a sudden plunge but a slow, relentless drip of poison seeping into every crevice of his consciousness, corroding his mind from the inside out like acid eating through fragile bone. The flat, once merely a scene of brutal horror, had become an obsession, a dark whisper that haunted the edges of his thoughts, twisting sleep into nightmares and waking hours into a dizzying haze of dread. He spent hours alone in his cramped apartment, pacing like a caged animal, the yellowed light of a single desk lamp casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to breathe and pulse with the same malevolent rhythm he sensed within the flat. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, had dulled into glassy pools rimmed with red, the telltale stain of sleepless nights and the weight of unspeakable things clawing at the fragile barrier of his sanity. Every image, every sound from the flat replayed in his mind like a grotesque film reel that refused to stop. The twisted, slick walls, the wet, sinewy tendrils, the muffled screams cut short, each detail engraved in his brain with the cruel precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He began to see the flat in everything. The peeling paint on his walls, the irregular shadows cast by passing cars outside, even the faint creaks of his own apartment, each sound a sinister echo of that living, hungry place. His breath would catch in his throat at the slightest noise, a distant siren, the clatter of a dropped object, the creak of a floorboard, each a trigger sending his heart pounding against his ribs like a desperate prisoner. Holtz's dreams, if one could call them that, were vivid nightmares where the flat whispered his name in a low, wet voice, promising secrets he both craved and feared. In these dreams, the walls bled with thick, black ichor that oozed and pooled at his feet, tendrils of flesh weaving through the cracks like living veins, beckoning him closer. He would reach out with trembling hands, fingers brushing against the cold, slick surfaces, only to recoil in terror as the walls throbbed and pulsed beneath his touch, alive and malevolent. The detective stopped eating regularly. Meals became an afterthought, a task too mundane for a mind so consumed. Coffee and cigarettes were his only sustenance, their bitter tang a small comfort amid the chaos that had taken root inside him. He began to isolate himself from friends and family, pushing away anyone who tried to reach out, convinced that they could never understand what he was facing. The flat was a secret he carried alone, a darkness that set him apart from the rest of the world. His colleagues noticed the change. His once steady hand now trembled during briefings, his voice sometimes cracking with exhaustion and frustration. Yet, no one dared question him directly, fear and respect kept them at bay. Holtz was the only one who understood the true horror lurking behind the closed door of that apartment, and the burden weighed heavily on his soul. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows of his apartment, Holtz sat hunched over a cluttered desk strewn with maps, photos, and notes, all obsessively annotated with his scrawled handwriting. Pins marked locations of disappearances, patterns traced in red ink connecting dots that no one else seemed to see. He was chasing ghosts, but the flat's influence was tangible in the way the lines seemed to twist and warp on the paper, the ink bleeding slightly as if dampened by unseen moisture. A sudden knock at the door startled him, his heart leaping into his throat. He hesitated, the memory of shadows and whispers frozen in his veins. When he finally opened the door, there was no one there, only a small envelope lying on the threshold, soaked from the rain. Inside, a single photograph, the interior of the flat, the walls slick and shining, a shadowy figure barely visible in the corner. No message. No signature. Holtz knew. The flat was watching him. It was calling. His hands trembled as he clutched the photo, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, and in that moment, he realized he was no longer just investigating the flat. He was part of it. The darkness had crept inside him, and there was no turning back. The changes started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A faint prickle beneath my skin like the crawling of invisible insects, a dull ache in my bones that no amount of rest could soothe, as if the building's rot was seeping into my very marrow, gnawing away at the edges of who I was. I tried to tell myself it was just stress, the fallout from everything I'd witnessed, the disappearances, the blood, the terrible silence that screamed louder than any voice. But deep down, I knew it was more. The flat was reaching inside me, pulling strings I didn't want it to touch. My reflection in the cracked mirror showed eyes rimmed with red, pupils dilated and wild, shadows pooling beneath them like spilled ink, an unspoken madness lurking just beneath the surface. Sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet and my thoughts too loud, I could swear I saw something move in the dark corners of the room, an impossible shape twisting, stretching, waiting. I'd blink, and it was gone, but the cold sweat that prickled down my spine told me it hadn't been a trick of the light. I started hearing voices. Whispers at first, barely audible, like distant conversations carried on the wind, soft syllables that curled around my ears and vanished when I turned my head. But they grew louder, more insistent, threading through my waking hours like a poisonous thread winding tighter with every heartbeat. The flat was calling me by name, promising knowledge, power, release. Depending on the moment, its tone shifted between seductive and cruel. Physically, my body betrayed me. I noticed strange marks appearing overnight, thin, red lines etched across my skin like veins of fire beneath the surface. They weren't scratches I could explain, nor were they familiar bruises. They pulsed faintly, a living network that throbbed in time with the flat's sick rhythm. My hands trembled more, sometimes spasming uncontrollably, fingers curling into claws I barely recognized as my own. I was changing, becoming something not quite human, something tethered to the building's dark heart. Sleep was a distant memory. When I did drift off, the flat invaded my dreams with horrific clarity, endless corridors slick with blood, walls breathing and bleeding, dismembered limbs reaching from the shadows to drag me under. I woke gasping, sheets tangled around me like a shroud, the taste of copper thick on my tongue. My heart hammered so violently I feared it would shatter my ribs, the pounding echoing in my ears long after the nightmare faded. Outside, the city moved on oblivious to the horror perched on its edge, the flat a black wound in the urban landscape that sucked in life and sanity alike. I found myself drawn back there again and again, compelled by a force I neither understood nor trusted. The air around the building was thick with something rotten and alive, a smell of decay mixed with faint hints of iron and something sweeter, darker, like the scent of death itself. Every step inside felt like sinking into cold water, the world narrowing until all that existed was the suffocating presence of that monstrous place. Sometimes, when I touched the walls, I could feel it, an electric pulse beneath the surface, as if the building had a heartbeat, slow and terrible. The walls weren't just walls anymore, they were flesh, breathing and hungry, veins coursing with a black, viscous fluid that oozed when scraped. I hated what I was becoming but feared I had already crossed the threshold beyond which there was no return. I kept a journal, desperate to hold on to what was left of my sanity, each page filled with fevered scrawlings and sketches, twisted corridors, faces melting into shadows, tendrils reaching out from every corner. Writing was the only anchor I had, the fragile thread that tethered me to reality even as it frayed beneath the weight of everything I was seeing and feeling. My thoughts spiraled in endless loops of fear and fascination. What was this place? Why did it consume those who entered? And why, of all the victims, was I the one left tethered to its madness? The answers slipped through my fingers like smoke, elusive and maddeningly out of reach. One night, I found myself standing in the center of the flat, breath ragged and skin slick with sweat, the walls closing in around me as if to crush my very soul. The voices were louder than ever, a chorus of shadows promising release or oblivion, their whispers curling around my mind like a serpent's coil. I wanted to scream, to break free, but the flat had already claimed me, body, mind, and soul, and there was no escaping the hunger beneath the plaster and paint. The knock came at an hour I wasn't expecting visitors, late afternoon, when the waning light filtered weakly through the grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the threadbare carpet and cracked plaster. My heart jumped, a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that pulsed through my veins like electricity, making my fingers twitch involuntarily as I stared at the door. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting whatever waited out there rot in silence, but something, maybe the small ember of my dwindling humanity, made me move. When I opened the door, a woman stood there. She was middle-aged, with sharp, practical eyes that seemed to see too much beneath the surface, as if her gaze could strip away all the masks the world wore. She wore a plain coat, the kind municipal workers wore, and held a clipboard cradled against her chest like a shield. The faint scent of old books and disinfectant clung to her, a strangely comforting mix amid the decay that surrounded me. "I'm Mary Ann," she said, voice steady but low, carefully measured, like a professional used to keeping distance from the chaos she encountered. "Building inspector. The landlord sent me to check the reports about complaints from the neighbors. Strange noises, bad smells. I thought it might be good to see it for myself." Her words, simple and grounded, somehow cut through the madness swirling in my mind, jolting me out of the fog of paranoia that had become my constant companion. For a brief moment, I saw her as an anchor, someone from the world I once belonged to, before the flat began to consume me. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in, the creak of the old door echoing like a gunshot through the silence. As she crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with rot and something far more sinister, an invisible weight that settled on us both. Mary Ann's face tightened, a flicker of unease crossing her features, but she pushed it down, professional instinct overriding fear. We moved through the flat together, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, the peeling wallpaper stained with dark, irregular patches, the floorboards warped and slick. The faint, sour smell of decay that clung to the air like a living thing. I watched her carefully, the tension coiling tighter in my chest as I sensed the flat responding to her presence, something dark and hungry stirring beneath the surface. "I don't know what's been happening here," I said, voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "But it's changing me. The place, it's alive somehow." She looked at me then, really looked, past the disheveled clothes, the wild eyes, the tremor in my hands. And something in her expression shifted. Concern. Fear. Recognition. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer, offering it to me with a nod. "Keep clean," she said simply, the practical advice cutting through the dread like a sharp blade. Sometimes the smallest things can keep us grounded. Her presence was a balm and a threat all at once. The flat didn't like her. Its pulse quickened, the walls seeming to shiver, the sickly slickness thickening beneath our feet. I could feel it, coiling like a beast ready to strike, but Mary Ann moved with purpose, lighting her flashlight, probing into the darkest corners, making notes on her clipboard as if daring the shadows to rise. As we reached the bedroom, the air grew colder, the silence oppressive. Mary Ann paused, shining her light on the corner where the dark stains pooled thickest on the floorboards. Her breath hitched, just for a fraction of a second, but she masked it well. "There's something here," she murmured, voice low. "Something unnatural. But it's not just the building. It's in the air, in the walls." I swallowed hard, heart pounding. "It's alive," I whispered, the truth tasting bitter. "And it's hungry." Mary Ann looked at me then, eyes sharp, fierce with determination. "We're going to get to the bottom of this. But you have to promise me one thing." "Don't go back in there alone. Not again." Her words were a lifeline, a fragile hope I wasn't sure I deserved. But as I watched her pack up her gear, preparing to leave, the flat groaned, a deep, guttural sound like a beast disturbed from slumber, and the room darkened, shadows stretching like claws toward her retreating back. I knew this was only the beginning. Mary Ann came back the next day with a grim determination that was impossible to ignore. A quiet fire burning behind her practical eyes that told me she was no stranger to places like this, places where the fabric of reality thinned and dark things waited just beyond the veil. She arrived with tools, a small flashlight with a bright, clinical beam, a digital air quality meter, and an assortment of protective gloves and masks. Every piece of equipment was arranged meticulously on the scratched wooden table in my apartment, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding us. Her presence was like a tether to sanity, but the flat fought it every step of the way. The air thickened as we approached the building, a choking miasma of rot and something unholy that made my stomach churn with a nausea deeper than any physical illness. The door to the flat itself seemed to pulse under my fingertips, as if it were breathing, alive and aware of our intrusion. Mary Ann was methodical. She tested the air for spores, dust, and toxins, scanning the walls for hidden mold colonies or chemical residues that might explain the sickness infecting me and the surrounding neighbors. But no scientific instrument could measure the malevolence lurking beneath the plaster and paint, the slow, wet heartbeat of a place that fed on fear and flesh. She moved with the careful precision of a surgeon, yet her lips tightened every time the beam of her flashlight revealed something new. Stains that shimmered wetly in the light, patterns of darkened residue that almost looked like veins snaking beneath the surface, and strange carvings etched shallowly into the wood, marks too deliberate to be the ravages of time or decay. In the bedroom, Mary Ann's face paled. She knelt and ran gloved fingers over the thick, dark scar that marred the floorboards, a jagged line that soaked deep into the wood, radiating a sickly warmth. The smell here was stronger. Coppery, metallic, with the faintest undertone of something sweet and rotten, like decayed fruit and fresh blood mixed in a sickening cocktail. "Whatever happened here wasn't natural," she whispered, voice barely audible above the flat's oppressive silence. "This isn't just a building falling apart. Something else has been here, something alive." I swallowed hard, the words confirming what I had feared for months. She pulled out a small digital camera and began documenting everything, snapping photos of the stains, the strange carvings, and the patches of wall where the plaster bubbled and shifted like skin. Then she stepped back and focused her beam on a narrow crack near the baseboard, a small fissure that had gone unnoticed in the dim light. From that crack, a faint movement startled us both. A slick, black tendril, thin and glistening, slithered out slowly, retracting as if sensing our presence, before vanishing back into the darkness. Mary Ann's breath hitched, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the camera lens. "This place is alive," she said finally, voice trembling but resolute. "And it's watching us." Over the following days, Mary Ann returned again and again, each visit peeling back more layers of the flat's terrible secret. She began setting up small sensors. Humidity meters, sound detectors, and motion sensors, placing them in strategic spots that pulsed with unnatural energy. She kept meticulous logs, cross-referencing my fragmented memories with the data she gathered, trying desperately to piece together a pattern. But the flat didn't welcome her scrutiny. Objects shifted when she wasn't looking, lights flickered and died suddenly, and strange noises, soft, wet squelches and distant, anguished whispers, echoed through the empty rooms. Mary Ann grew increasingly pale, her hands shaking as the boundary between scientific curiosity and raw terror blurred into one. One evening, after a particularly harrowing visit, Mary Ann barely made it out of the building before collapsing in the street, retching violently. When I helped her to her feet, she was shaking, eyes wide with a silent horror she refused to name. "They're not just stains," she whispered hoarsely, voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "They're remains. Human remains. The tests, there's DNA, blood, tissue, fresh and decomposed, all mixed together. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat, the implication sinking in like a stone in my gut. She paused, eyes darting to the flat's looming facade, shadows pooling in the windows like watching eyes. Whatever this thing is, it's been feeding, alive and growing. And if it's got its hooks this deep, it won't let go easily. Her warnings echoed the dread twisting in my own chest, the same gnawing certainty that the flat was not just a place, but a predator, and we were its prey. The more Marianne uncovered, the deeper her fear grew, but so did her determination. She was no longer just an inspector, she was a warrior waging a desperate battle against an ancient, consuming evil that mocked her every effort with silent, suffocating patience. And somewhere in the shadows, the flat waited. Patient, hungry, and utterly relentless. The photographs didn't make sense. Marianne sat at her kitchen table long past midnight, the camera's tiny LCD screen flickering with images that bent the boundaries of logic and anatomy. Stains and impossible patterns, fibers that looked like sinew laced through cracked drywall, something that might have been a handprint but stretched too long, too thin, with 6 fingers and ragged edges like torn muscle. She enlarged one photo until the pixels distorted and broke apart. Beneath the stain on the bedroom floor, a circular pattern etched faintly into the wood. It was no ordinary water damage. It was surgical. Each time she returned to the flat, the sense of being watched grew more unbearable, like standing on the precipice of an open mouth, warm breath curling up from some black, toothless throat, eager for another taste. She had never believed in hauntings, in cursed places, in metaphysical evil, but the thing upstairs was not a ghost. It had mass, influence, and a hunger that defied every natural law she knew. She went back the next morning, this time alone. No clipboard. No equipment. Just a crowbar, and gloves thick enough to keep skin from touching anything directly. The flat was waiting. The moment she stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped, not in degrees, but in essence. Cold in the marrow. Cold in the blood. The door creaked shut behind her without help, and she paused to steady her breathing, watching dust spiral in the slanted beam of her flashlight. She made for the far wall in the bedroom, the one with the warped patchwork of dried fluid and strange, twitching bubbles just beneath the plaster. She wedged the crowbar beneath the edge of the baseboard and pulled. A sound like tearing cartilage echoed through the room. Not plaster. Not drywall. Something else. Behind it, the wall was pulsing. Faintly. Slowly. Beneath a thin membrane that looked disturbingly like pale flesh, blue-green veins throbbed rhythmically, spreading across the interior surface like a cardiovascular map. She recoiled as the wall convulsed under her light, reacting. She took a photo. The camera refused to focus. She switched to the crowbar again, trembling now, pressing harder, skin slick with cold sweat inside her gloves. She carved deeper. The membrane gave way with a wet pop, and a foul, coppery stench burst outward, filling her throat with the taste of blood and bile. Beneath the torn layer was not insulation, not wood, not concrete, but meat. Fibrous, blood-slicked muscle stretched taut over something that twitched and flexed as if trying to withdraw. The wall had nerves. She stumbled backward and fell, scraping her forearm against the warped floor, and for a moment, she thought she heard it. Just beneath the threshold of sound, a deep, animalistic gurgle, like a sleeping leviathan disturbed in its dreaming. She fled that time. Ran. Back to the street, to the cold air that didn't stink of death and rot and bile. But she returned. She had to. 3 days later, Marianne broke into the apartment directly beneath the flat. The tenant had moved out months ago, driven by the same dreams that now haunted her. Shapes pressed against the walls, wet footsteps in the hallway, strange static in her ears when she tried to sleep. The lower apartment was empty. Silent. Untouched. But when she peeled back the carpet in the living room, she found a large, rotting stain bleeding up from the subfloor, dark, thick, and crusted over in rings. She tapped it with her boot. hollow. She fetched a hammer from the truck, her hands moving mechanically. She smashed through the boards, dust and wood splinters flying in every direction. What lay beneath wasn't a crawlspace, nor a foundation, there was no cement. There was a cavity. Inside, pressed like fossilized remains into the meat of the floor above, were bones. Dozens of them. Adult and child. Old and fresh. A mandible hung open in a frozen scream. Ribs arched upward into the darkness like the inside of a ribcage. Strips of long-dried tendon still clung to a fractured femur. And then, movement. A slick, wet pulling sound behind her. Marianne turned in time to see the wall ripple, like something massive was brushing against the inside of a stomach, and then bulge outward, bloating like a cyst ready to burst. From that bloated mass, a single eye opened. No iris. No white. Just black. Bottomless. And it blinked. She screamed. The kind of scream that tears something loose from inside you, the kind that leaves your throat raw and your mind unmoored. She didn't remember running out. She didn't remember locking the truck doors or driving through 4 red lights to get back to her tiny apartment with its dusty ceiling fan and humming refrigerator and lack of sentient architecture. That night, she didn't sleep. The walls in her apartment were quiet, but she dreamed of mouths, dozens, hundreds, forming in the ceiling, in the floor, in her own hands, whispering in her mother's voice, "You're inside it now." The next morning, she called the Department of Buildings. They told her the property had no permits. The ownership records had gaps, years missing, multiple shell companies folding into each other like matryoshka dolls. She contacted the police. An officer took her report but never followed up. Then her emails started disappearing. Then her voice messages played back only static. The flat was reaching out, touching her life, worming its way into her space the way it had burrowed into me. On her 5th return, she came with gasoline. She was slipping, and I could see it in the way her hands moved, trembling just slightly but often, tremors too subtle for anyone unmarked by the flat to notice, but I had become something else, something attuned, eyes tuned to frequencies normal people were never meant to witness, and what I saw in her was the same sickness I felt burrowing through me since the first time I stood at the threshold of that damn place. Marianne. Sharp, rational, too stubborn to fear what she couldn't define, was now caught in its rhythm, a dissonant heartbeat growing beneath her skin, one that pulsed in time with the wet, gurgling shifts of the ceiling above us. From the window of my own apartment, a floor below the rotten meat that had once been a flat, I watched her standing in the alley out back, hands stuffed in her coat pockets, staring up at the top floor like it had personally insulted her, lips moving silently as if she were reciting something, remembering some conversation or pattern or fragment of her own failing logic that might finally explain what we both knew was never going to make sense in the language of science. She stayed there for 15 minutes, motionless except for her mouth, before disappearing into the building again, and I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I could feel the flat wake up, like something uncoiling behind the walls, something stretching its long limbs in anticipation of play. When she came back down that night, her clothes were streaked with dust, black grime smeared across the collar of her coat and the sleeves of her gloves, but it was the blood. Just a little at the temple, just a thread clinging to her hairline, that told me she'd found the place behind the wall. I knew it because it had marked me too, once. That blood doesn't come from injury. It comes from the air. You don't bleed because something cut you. You bleed because the flat changes you, ruptures you from the inside out. She didn't see me watching her from behind the slats of the blind, but I watched everything. Watched her stumble down the sidewalk with her keys dangling in one shaking hand, watched her stop just once to lean against the chain-link fence and empty her stomach into the gutter, her back arching with the violence of it, like the sickness was trying to crawl up and out of her body with its own hands. I thought she wouldn't come back. I thought I'd finally be alone with it again. But I underestimated her. The next time I heard her footsteps on the stairs, they were heavier. Like she'd added weight to herself on purpose, like she'd decided to anchor her sanity with resolve and refused to float away into the dark like all the others who'd vanished. And maybe I should have warned her. Maybe I should have stepped into the hallway and told her what the flat really does when it knows your name, when it's tasted your breath and heard your bones sing in the quiet. But I didn't. Instead, I watched. I watched her through the crack in my door when she passed by, saw the determination in her clenched jaw and the trembling flicker in her left eye. That twitch. I'd seen it before. I'd felt it before. I still do, every time the silence stretches too long and the flat starts humming in my teeth. She didn't knock on my door anymore. She'd stopped trying to drag me out of hiding, out of fear. Somewhere deep down, she must have realized I was past saving. Or maybe I'd just become part of the flat's furniture, another motionless thing left in the corners, too soaked in its sickness to move. The smell was different now. It had changed in the last 48 hours. Not just mold. Not just blood. There was something sweet beneath it. Ripe. Fermented. Like fruit rotting in a crawlspace, heavy and warm. The kind of scent that clings to your nostrils long after you've left the room, crawling into your sinuses and sitting behind your eyes. I knew what that meant. The flat was preparing something. It was building. Late that night, I heard her scream. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. It was sharp, surgical, a quick slice of raw horror dragged across the quiet like a scalpel across muscle, and it cut right through the walls and landed in my chest, and for a moment, I held my breath. Not out of fear. No, not anymore. It was recognition. Because I had made that same sound. Once. Before the flat changed me. I went upstairs that night, barefoot, each step a decision, each creaking board a breath held between possible futures. Her flashlight was lying on the hallway floor, the beam split by a long crack in the lens, casting a skewed triangle of light against the doorframe. The door to the flat was open. Wide open. The air inside pulsed. Thicker than atmosphere. A womb. A lung. I didn't step inside. I didn't need to. I could hear her inside. Not screaming anymore. Speaking. Words that weren't English. Words that weren't anything. Wet. Clicking. Like mandibles scraping together behind her voice. She wasn't alone. And that's when I understood, really understood, that the flat didn't kill you. It took you. It rewrote you. And it had started with me. I backed away, one step at a time, the hall seeming to stretch with every inch I moved until it felt like I would never make it to the stairs, and all the while, that voice, that Marianne but not voice, continued muttering from inside the room, each syllable sliding deeper into my ears and crawling into the folds of my brain like centipedes nesting. The flashlight flickered out. Total darkness. I ran. Back into my own apartment. I slammed the door. And I bolted it. But it didn't matter. The flat was everywhere now. I could hear her footsteps pacing above me. Only they weren't hers anymore. They were heavier. Slower. Wet. Like something walking on joints that didn't bend the way human bones should. And then she stopped. Right above me. Right above my bed. And I swear to God, I felt the ceiling breathe. It didn't stop. The sound above my bed. That wet, deliberate cadence. Like flesh dragging itself across the floorboards in intervals too slow to be human. I lay beneath the ceiling, eyes wide open in the dark, staring into nothing, the air so dense I couldn't tell if I was breathing or drowning. The walls pulsed with it, the same breath I'd felt when I backed out of the flat's open door, now moving in waves through the drywall, thickening in the joints, bleeding from the corners like sweat on the skin of something alive. I wanted to move. But moving would mean acknowledging it. And I knew what happened when you acknowledged it. The steps continued. Back and forth. Heel dragging, toe thudding, like she was trying to wear a new skin that didn't fit yet. She wasn't walking anymore. She was breaking in her body, testing the shape she'd been remade into. Every few minutes, she'd stop. And that silence, that was worse. In the quiet, I could hear her weight shift, hear the bones pop, once, twice, maybe more, as something re-articulated behind the plaster and dust and water-damaged boards of the ceiling. The scent came next. That overripe, sweet dead scent like decomposing peaches left in a paper bag, thickened with an iron tang of blood turned stale and wet skin soaked too long in its own warmth. I tried to sit up once. Just once. The moment I did, something slid across the ceiling, fast. Not footsteps. Not walking. Sliding. As though she dropped to all fours and was skittering like an animal, her limbs bending at the wrong angles, elbows cracking in reverse. I froze again. And I whispered her name. Not because I thought it would reach her. Not because I thought Marianne was still in there. But because I needed to say it. Marianne, silence. Then, in a voice that no longer had lungs, "You saw me." The whisper came not from above, not directly, but through the walls. As if the plaster was her throat, the wiring her vocal cords, the very grain of the wood her teeth clicking softly between syllables. "You saw me in the hallway," it hissed. "You left me. You let it in." "No," I breathed. "You did that yourself." Silence again. The creak of the floorboards retreated slowly, inch by inch, until the sound of her dislocated gait reached the far side of the apartment. Then she began to crawl. I could hear her. Nails scraping the underside of the ceiling, long dragging pulls as if she were worming her way through the infrastructure itself, pushing her limbs through insulation and joists, dragging whatever she'd become through the soft, pulpy meat of the building. She was coming toward the wall now. The one behind my head. Closer. Closer. Until I felt her breath. No, not breath. The wall behind my bed bulged. I don't know how else to describe it. It didn't crack. It didn't warp. It pushed outward. Like a lung inflating, like someone pressing their whole face into it from the other side. And there it was. An imprint. A forehead. A nose. A mouth, stretched wide in a grin that pushed against the drywall hard enough to bow it inward, creaking slightly beneath the pressure. I could see the outline of her teeth, far too many of them, like a row of broken bones jammed into rotting gums. And then, she whispered through the wall itself. "You remember what it felt like, when it touched your mind." I curled my knees to my chest in the bed, not even realizing I'd begun to cry. It wasn't sobbing. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. She was right. I remembered it. That first night. When the flat had reached out and opened something in me, peeled me back like a lid and poured something black and writhing inside. I hadn't been able to sleep since. Not really. Not without hearing the scratching. "You belong in here," she whispered. "You started this. We're waiting." I couldn't take it. I leapt from the bed and grabbed the aluminum bat I kept beside the dresser. It was a childish weapon, dented from 1,000 failed attempts to feel safe. But it was the only thing that ever made me feel like I had some sort of boundary, something between it and me. I held the bat and backed into the living room, my feet hitting cold tile. The ceiling above me trembled, dust rained down from the corners, and I heard her crawl again, this time above the living room ceiling. She was following me. The whisper came again, closer, more eager now. "We can feel you thinking about the hall." I froze. How did she, the stairs, she purred, her voice now split across 3 different points in the walls, all speaking together in discordant chorus. "You want to run. But you know it's in the hallway now. It spreads. You let it out." I bolted. I hit the door, unlocked all 4 latches in a blur, and threw it open, and stopped. The hallway was wrong. Not just dim. Not just shadowed. The walls pulsed. The ceiling, warped downward, bowed with moisture, thick yellow fluid oozing from one corner like sap from a diseased tree. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and underneath it, veins. Blue-black capillaries. Running under the plaster. Like the building had grown a circulatory system. I couldn't move. Behind me, I heard her crawl down the wall, her joints popping in delight, scrape, 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 closer now, behind the kitchenette. Moving like a spider that had never once seen a reason to be afraid. I ran. Into the hallway. Down the stairs. My bare feet slipped once on the soaked linoleum step, but I caught myself, hands slapping against the railing, only the railing pulsed too, like I'd grabbed a snake mid-dream. I burst into the front lobby and out into the street, only to find it silent. Dead silent. No lights in the windows across the street. No traffic. Not even the buzz of the street lamp, which now flickered and bent slightly, as if softened by heat. I turned to look up at the flat. And she was there. Marianne. Not in the window. Inside the wall. Her shape, pressed against the living room drywall of the upper flat, backlit by nothing. Just her body, inside the plaster, frozen in some grotesque position with her arm bent up behind her back, her head twisted halfway around and her grin still stretched ear to ear, teeth pushing against the surface like bone trying to erupt from thin skin. I stared up for too long. And when I blinked, she was gone. The window pane rippled once. And I heard her voice, in my head now. Not words. Not sounds. Just a pull. A tug in the direction of the stairwell again. Come back. That's when I realized, there was no escaping anymore. The flat wasn't a place. It was in me. And so was she. I ran. Out into the night, into the street still slick with the glistening sheen of earlier rain, the sidewalk glimmering with the reflected stretch of sickly orange street lamp light that pulsed like something half living, half dying under the weight of a broken sky. I didn't look back, not even once. Not even when I felt the building breathe behind me, its windows exhaling steam like mouths pressed against invisible glass, the night around me thick with the sour scent of mildew and rust and something far older than rot. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that old photos are quiet, too still, too framed, the trees on either side of the street frozen mid-sway in a breeze I could no longer feel. My footsteps slapped the concrete too loud, too alone, like I was the only sound permitted to exist outside the flat's orbit, and that silence, more than anything, told me something had already followed me out. I passed the corner bodega, its neon open sign still glowing red behind a fogged-over window, but there was no hum of the refrigeration units, no flicker from the television usually perched on the shelf behind the counter, and no sign of Mr. Gaddis, the old man who'd owned the place since before I'd moved in. The door hung slightly ajar, just wide enough to see that every single item had been removed from the shelves, leaving behind a hollow echo and something even more unsettling, a pattern etched into the floor in dried, flaking black-brown, something that might have once been blood but had since turned to dust and oil and silence. I didn't stop to look closer. I didn't want to know. I couldn't. I kept running, my breath tearing out of my throat in ragged bursts, heart stuttering inside me like it was trying to claw its way out through my ribs. Every step felt wrong now, like the street was subtly shifting beneath me, warping in imperceptible increments. The sidewalks no longer ran straight. They curved gently where they hadn't before, turning alleyways into dead ends and intersections into loops. I reached Pine and 6th. But Pine ran the wrong direction now, and 6th just stopped abruptly, vanishing into a chain-link fence that hadn't been there before, rusted over like it had existed for decades. I tried to retrace my steps, doubling back toward the train station, but when I turned the corner, I found myself standing in front of my own building again. The flat. But not as it had been. No. This time, it had grown. The building rose 4 stories higher now, blackened brickwork towering above the others like a growth, cancerous, raw, wrong, its windows lit from within by a dull, pulsing glow that didn't flicker like light should but instead throbbed with the rhythm of something organic. The entrance had changed. The stairs were gone, replaced by a door sunk into the base of the wall like a wound, sealed over with what looked like translucent skin. And something moved behind it. Something leaned against it from the other side, its shadow shifting slowly like it was listening to me think. I backed away, dizzy. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, heading now toward the bus terminal 2 miles down. I passed 3 more storefronts I'd never seen before, one with mannequins that turned their heads as I passed, though their bodies never moved. One with a boarded-up entrance oozing a slow, viscous black fluid through the cracks in the wood, and one that had no door at all, just a wide black rectangle of space that seemed to whisper, "Come home," as I crossed in front of it. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the corner of Fulton and Grand and saw the buses, all parked in a row like waiting animals, dark, engines off, windows fogged with moisture. A faint hope bloomed in my chest, ragged and small and already dying, but I clung to it. I climbed the stairs of the nearest one, reaching for the emergency override on the door, and stopped. Inside, the seats were full. But not with people. They sat perfectly upright, each one wearing the same navy blue hoodie, heads bowed low, hands clasped in their laps. But where their faces should have been, there was nothing. No skin, no bone, no eyes, just blank ovals of wrinkled flesh, folded smooth like the flat underside of a peeled fruit. As if something had worn them down to silence, chewed away identity, personality, thought, until only form remained. One of them twitched. Just once. A slow tilt of the head toward me. No sound. No breath. But I felt it again, that pull, that low gravitational pressure inside my skull that said belonging in a voice I could almost understand. I ran. Down the steps. Across the lot. Back into the street. And I realized then, it wasn't just the building. The whole city was changing. The sky had gone wrong. The stars were moving in patterns I couldn't track, constellations reshaping themselves slowly into symbols that pulsed with some cold intent, aligning not for beauty or order but for something older. A message. A summoning. I needed to leave. I needed to get farther. I cut through the back alleys behind the old mechanics row, hopping over fences, slipping on loose gravel, nearly twisting my ankle in a pothole filled with what looked like congealed blood. The walls around me breathed in again, soft exhales from the brick, warm and sweet with the rot of something buried just beneath the stone. I could hear something in the storm drains now, whispering up at me through the grates. Words, maybe. Names. My name. Over and over. Said by a voice that used to belong to my mother. I reached the freeway on-ramp an hour later, soaked in sweat, knees buckling, lungs torn raw from screaming at no one. I stumbled up the incline, heart leaping as I saw a car approaching, a dark SUV, headlights cutting through the mist like knives. I waved it down. I screamed. Please. Help. Please. The SUV slowed. It came to a halt beside me. The window rolled down. And there she was. Marianne. But not her. She was clean again, normal. Dressed in the same outfit she'd worn the last time I saw her before the transformation, her eyes bright and brown, her smile soft, gentle. Get in, she said. It's not safe out here. I staggered back, choking on my own breath. No. You're not her. She frowned, tilting her head. What are you talking about? It's me. I got away too. She hesitated, glancing behind her at the back seat. They'll find us if we don't go now. Get in. Something moved in the back seat. A shape. A shape with too many elbows. I turned and ran. The SUV didn't follow me. But her voice did. From everywhere. From the overpasses. From the trees. From the sky. You'll come back. We're still in you. You left the door open. I collapsed sometime near dawn. I don't remember where, an underpass maybe, or an abandoned office park. The buildings around me had melted into gray stone tombs, windows dark, street signs written in a language I couldn't read but felt deeply familiar. Like a memory of a language I'd once spoken in a dream. I stared at the sky. And saw a door. Not in a metaphorical sense. An actual door. Hanging open in the middle of the air, far above the city, its wood rotted, its knob turning slowly, the other side lit with a color that doesn't exist. Something stood on the threshold. Watching. Waiting. Smiling with 100 mouths. Detective Holtz didn't sleep anymore. Not really. What passed for rest came in fleeting bursts. 10-minute blackout stolen from beneath harsh desk lamps and caffeine-pinned eyelids, jolted awake by half-dreams of blood-rusted stairwells and windows with no glass, only skin pulled taut and pulsing like it was breathing. His desk had become more than a workspace now, it was a shrine to the spiral he couldn't climb back out of, a hive of paper scraps, photographs, pinned string, hand-drawn diagrams, burnt cassette tapes, and increasingly violent sketches he didn't remember making. Each corner of the desk was covered in layers of case files, some official, most not, clippings of missing persons going back decades, maybe longer, names that had never connected before but now circled around a single address like vultures, Flat 6C. It wasn't on any lease. Not in city records. Not in zoning reports. But it was there. The tenants were never permanent, never stable. Drifters, loners, students, retirees, names that came and vanished without trace. One death. Then 2. Then 17. Most declared overdoses. Suicides. Mental breakdowns. But every time he examined the autopsies, and he had, obsessively, he saw details others missed. Teeth missing. Fingertips worn down to the bone. Eyes evaporated within sockets that showed no rupture, only absorption. Holtz had redrawn the floor plan of the building by hand 15 times. It kept changing. Not the official plan, that stayed the same, but something about it never matched what survivors claimed. Hallways that didn't exist. Doors that appeared only at night. And that stairwell, oh, the stairwell, that wet gap between the 3rd and 4th floor, where echoes traveled up but never down. He'd begun to suspect his own precinct. The captain had ordered him off the case 3 weeks prior, told him he was too close, too invested. But something in the captain's voice had sounded off, like the words were borrowed, fed into him. Like the man behind the desk was no longer the man Holtz had served under for 10 years, but a shape wearing his tone. So Holtz stopped reporting in. He worked from his apartment now, which had grown into a cluttered tomb of paranoia, walls pinned with floor-to-ceiling timelines, a portable whiteboard smeared with blood more often than dry erase, dozens of notebooks filled with looping cursive that had begun to diverge into different handwriting styles. Each one responding to the last. He wasn't alone in here. Not anymore. The walls clicked at night. That was the word he used, clicked. Not creaked. Not shifted. They communicated, a sound somewhere between teeth grinding and static boiling, and sometimes, if he turned the TV volume to 0 and stared at the blank screen long enough, he'd see shadows moving behind the reflection. He couldn't tell anyone. They'd take him off everything. Lock him up. Medicate him until the gaps were sealed again. But the gaps, those gaps, were how the truth got through. So he let it in. The last lead had been the young woman, Mary Ann Rourke. Graduate student, lived alone, bright future, real family. She'd sent in a public records request for the building's previous owners, and Holtz had intercepted it. She wasn't just curious. She was called. She'd been drawn to the flat like a needle to the magnet, just like Holtz, just like the others. The death spiral never began with violence. It began with curiosity. Her voicemail still played on loop in his headphones when he needed to drown out the building's hum. She sounded confused. Disoriented. There was a moment, 12 seconds in, when her voice dropped an octave. I think I see someone watching me. Not something. Someone. That mattered. He printed that quote out in 72-point font and pinned it above his window. Next to the words he'd torn from a news clipping, coroner uncertain, no mouth, still screaming. The press hadn't touched the case in weeks. Too messy. Too scattered. But Holtz had pieced together his own internal trail. Marianne wasn't just gone, she was taken. He had video stills from across the street. Surveillance footage from a neighboring deli. The frames showed her entering the building on a Thursday morning. Never coming out. But something else did. Blurry. Too tall. Elongated in ways the lens couldn't correct. He tried to stabilize the frames. Failed. Tried again. The software glitched every time it touched her silhouette, like her presence infected even digital memory. He finally sent the file to an old friend in digital forensics, off the books. 3 days later, that friend was found in his bathtub. No water. Just a spiral of teeth arranged around his body. Not his. Holtz burned the hard drive. He knew the flat was changing now, metastasizing. Each time he walked the surrounding blocks, he felt the pull, subtle at first. People missing. Street vendors no longer occupying their usual corners. Names of stores changing midweek. Flyers stapled to trees and poles depicting people he remembered seeing in dreams. The building was no longer content with passive hunger. It had become sentient. The deeper Holtz went into the research, the more fractured his own reality became. His reflection sometimes moved out of sync, lagging behind him, or smiling when he wasn't. Food rotted within minutes. He found his own fingernails under his pillow once, lined up like piano keys. Once, he tried to leave the city for a weekend. His car wouldn't start. When he tried a rental, every route redirected, back to the building. He began receiving phone calls with no audio. Just the sound of wet chewing. The final crack came a few nights later. 3:17 a.m. Holtz had been cross-referencing old fire department records when he found it, a maintenance report from 1954. Mention of a sealed floor above the 6th. Unofficial. No access permitted. Reason given, unsafe theological space. The word theological had been scratched out and replaced with structural in shaky pen. He stared at it for hours. Then he began drawing again. Not in his sketch pad, on the walls. Floor plans. Names. A spiral that began as a doorway and ended as a face. He was no longer sure whether he was investigating the flat, or becoming it. Or remembering it. He dreamed of red hallways now. Of doors that opened inward into ribcages. Of faces sewn shut with black thread, and the needle passed back and forth by a smiling child with Marianne's eyes. That night, he heard someone outside his door. Soft scratching. Not knocking. He waited. Then the envelope slid under. No return address. Inside, a Polaroid of his apartment, taken from the ceiling corner. He could see himself in the chair. Asleep. Behind him, someone watching. Marianne. Or what she had become. Holtz didn't scream. He simply turned off the light. And whispered, "I'm ready." Detective Holtz didn't pack a bag. He didn't need one. There were no supplies that could prepare a man for the thing waiting inside that building. No gun, no badge, no holy water. No measured words, no clearance from the department. The confrontation wasn't going to be a tactical operation. It would be sacrament, he knew that now. One that demanded an offering of skin, sanity, and all the twisted knowledge he'd gathered in the wasted weeks since the first call about Marianne. He stood outside the building as the sun died low on the horizon, the light falling over the crumbling brick like dried blood. The air itself changed the closer he got, smelled wetter, older, like something buried too long. The cracks in the concrete outside the stoop pulsed faintly with a heat that came from below, and Holtz thought he could hear something, some low grinding noise under the hum of the city, like bones churning in thick, wet mulch. The tenants had all vanished. No lights behind the windows anymore. No sounds of televisions or footsteps or music through walls. Just silence. And waiting. The front door didn't resist him, it wanted him inside. It creaked open on its own, a yawn of ancient wood and breathless hunger. The lobby smelled of old metal and something copper-sweet, like rust soaked in meat. The light bulbs above flickered in a pulse, not random, but patterned. Morse code. A heartbeat. He ascended the first set of stairs, the weight of the pistol in his hand meaningless. He didn't expect it to matter, not here, not now. The gun was for him, if it came to that. It had one round. He'd cleaned it 3 times before coming. Still, it felt alien in his grip. There were other laws here. Other truths. The walls of the stairwell wept. Not metaphorically, they literally dripped. It wasn't water. It was thicker. Clung in strands that broke like cobwebs on his jacket. The steps groaned under him, but not with weight, more like recognition. Like they'd been waiting for his feet, and now that they were here, they were adjusting, shifting their grain to match his pace. He didn't look up. He didn't look down. Not anymore. He reached the 3rd floor landing and paused. The hallway stretched too far in both directions. A trick of the light, he told himself, but the fluorescent bulb above him was flickering like it was drowning in milk, and the wallpaper had started to peel back in perfect curls, revealing layers beneath it, each older, each more organic. He thought one of them had hair. Blonde. Curly. Still wet. Flat 6C was 4 floors above, but the numbers made no sense now. The plaques on the doors twisted as he passed them. One read, Grieve. Another read, Hunger. He reached for the next and watched as it melted under his fingertips and reformed into, Come. Holtz didn't turn back. He began to ascend again. And again. And again. No matter how many stairs he climbed, the numbers didn't change. There was no 6th floor. No 7th. But the air got colder, heavier. Time started to bleed sideways, his watch stopped ticking. The second hand spun backward, then forward, then stopped entirely. He heard a baby cry. It came from somewhere behind the walls. Then came the laughter. Marianne's voice, only wrong. Slurred. Liquid. Like she was speaking through a throat full of congealed blood. She said his name. Not a scream. Not a call for help. A welcome. He reached a door. It had no number. But he knew. This was it. It was made of some strange black wood that pulsed faintly with heat, and as his hand neared the handle, his fingertips bled. A thin line of blood ran down the back of his palm and the door drank it in. The lock clicked. Not open, unlatched. Like a throat relaxing to swallow. He pushed. Inside was flat 6C. Or what had been 6C. The room had grown. Walls too high. Corners that didn't meet. Furniture that moved slightly every time he blinked, chairs twitching toward him, the couch breathing. The wallpaper here pulsed. It was stitched together in strips of flesh. Each strip tattooed with dates. Names. Coordinates. One bore his name. There were no windows. But the light inside wasn't darkness. It was living. A constant red pulse. Not illumination, awareness. It watched him, followed him, and when he stepped into the center of the room, the door vanished behind him. Simply gone. The floor bent under his weight, soft like lung tissue. His boots made squelching sounds with each step. The air had weight. It resisted his breath. Smelled like birth and rot. He reached into his coat and took out the Polaroid, the one left under his door, the one showing him asleep at his desk with Marianne behind him. He held it up. "Why me?" he whispered, not sure to whom. The answer came through the floor, into his bones. "You remember." The words weren't spoken. They inhabited him. Like heat through a fever. Like oil through the lungs. He dropped the photograph. It burned in midair. Ash before it hit the ground. The walls of the flat began to unfold. Literally peel open. Revealing faces. So many. Pressed into the surfaces, mouth sewn shut, eyes wide, skin pulled tight around muscle that had no business being animate. They weren't dead. They were held. Held in memory. In resonance. And Holtz felt it, his own memories dislodging, flowing toward the ceiling like smoke. The faces began to chant. Not words. Moments. His childhood. The day his brother drowned. The second week of the academy. The night he shot a man and cried afterward. The time he ignored the homeless woman outside Precinct 9 and found her dead 2 weeks later, teeth missing. The flat fed on what he carried. And it was still hungry. I don't remember how I got past the mouths, how I scrambled away from the mouths, the screaming, teeth gnashing, ragged voices calling my name, because the moment I crossed that threshold, the flat swallowed me whole. The floor beneath me no longer felt solid, but a living thing, a pulsing heart of writhing muscle and sinew that squeezed the air from my lungs, thick with the scent of blood and rot. Each step I took sank deeper into flesh, and the walls themselves began to breathe. Exhaling cold, rancid breath that clung to my skin like a shroud. I couldn't tell if I was descending or climbing. The stairs behind me had folded away, replaced by an endless tunnel of veins and nerve endings, slick with ichor that oozed in slow, rhythmic pulses. Light, if you could call it that, came from somewhere beneath the walls themselves, a sickly glow that illuminated patches of raw, exposed muscle intertwined with fragments of shattered bone. The flat was alive. Or at least a vessel for something that was. I didn't know how much time passed as I trudged through this labyrinth of flesh and bone, my fingers scraping against rough tissue that bled at my touch, leaving crimson trails on my skin and clothes. The air was thick, impossibly heavy, pressing against my chest in waves that made each breath a struggle, but I kept moving forward, driven by a force I couldn't name. A desperate need to understand, to confront what had taken Marianne, what had torn through the hazmat crew, what had turned an entire building into a mausoleum of forgotten horrors. I came to a chamber. It was vast, a cathedral of gore and memory. The ceiling arched high above me, pulsing with light that mimicked a heart beating, slow, deliberate, inexorable. The floor beneath was a mosaic of faces, frozen in expressions of terror, grief, and pain, pressed into the flesh as if trapped in amber. Some opened their eyes as I walked past, mouths opening in silent screams that echoed in the cavernous space. In the center of the chamber stood a grotesque altar, twisted limbs entwined around shards of glass and rusted metal, festooned with matted hair and shredded fabric stained dark with blood. The altar was wet, glistening with fresh fluid that pooled in shallow craters on its surface. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding, every nerve screaming for me to turn back. But I couldn't. On the altar lay something I recognized immediately, a fragment of Marianne's blouse, torn and soaked in something darker than blood. Next to it, a small, broken photograph, the same one I'd dropped earlier, showing me and Marianne, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. I reached out, fingers trembling, to touch the cloth, and as I did, the chamber shuddered. From the walls erupted a chorus of whispers, soft at first, then growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, Marianne's voice among them, distorted but clear. "Help me, don't let it win, it's not what you think." I clenched my fists, the pain in my palms blinding, the pressure in my chest tightening like a vice. The faces on the floor began to shift, contorting into scenes from memories I tried to bury, visions of failure, regret, and helplessness. Each one a stab of guilt twisting deep inside me. I stumbled back, the altar groaning as the limbs wrapped tighter around the shards of glass, pulling free and morphing into jagged claws that reached for me. I fired the pistol again. The single bullet tore through the claws, but the chamber only pulsed faster, the light flickering wildly as if wounded but far from defeated. Then I heard it, a wet, dragging sound behind me. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. There, emerging from a fissure in the flesh-covered wall, was Marianne, or what she had become. Her skin hung loose in ragged strips, revealing muscle and bone beneath. Her eyes were milky with death, but they burned with malevolent intelligence. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, a jagged maw lined with shards of broken teeth. She smiled. Slowly. The smile of something that no longer belonged to the world of the living. I raised the gun again, hands shaking, but she was faster. She lunged, claws extended, fingers ending in hooked nails that tore through my jacket, ripping flesh beneath. Pain exploded across my arm, burning and raw. I fired again. This time the bullet caught her in the throat, and she shrieked. A sound that vibrated through the chamber, cracking the walls, shaking the very bones beneath my feet. But still she came. I retreated toward the altar, desperation fueling my movements. I grabbed a shard of glass embedded in the altar's twisted limbs, its edge jagged and sharp. She lunged again, and I plunged the glass deep into her chest. She screamed, staggering back, but as she fell, the chamber around us warped again. The faces on the floor screaming in agony as if the wound in her body rippled through them all. I didn't wait to see what came next. I ran. The corridors twisted and writhed, the walls pulsing with an eerie rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. The flat fought to keep me, walls folding, ceilings dropping, floors giving way, but I pushed forward, breath ragged, blood dripping from my wounds. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glimmer of light, a way out. I lunged toward it. The light grew brighter, colder, until it engulfed me completely. I collapsed onto cold concrete, gasping, as the flat's hold on me loosened. I was outside. The building stood silent and still, a hollow shell once more. But I knew the flat wasn't finished with me. It would never be. The flat was no longer just a building. It had become a creature of my mind, a monstrous extension of my guilt and obsession, reaching out with tendrils of flesh and shadow to pull me into its deepest, darkest bowels. I knew now, as I stood before that gaping maw of warped walls and dripping membranes, that there was no turning back. I was here to end it, or become part of it forever. The air was thick with the stench of decay and old blood, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me with the weight of every forgotten scream, every soul the flat had consumed like a ravenous beast. The ceiling above me seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a living heart, the walls breathing, contracting, a terrible, endless inhalation and exhalation. I gripped my pistol tighter, fingers slick with sweat and blood from the wounds Marianne had given me, my mind sharpened by terror and fury. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I was too far gone, too deep into this nightmare. The flat was my confession booth, my tormentor, and my judge. A low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness ahead, and the floor beneath me shifted, undulating like a sea of flesh. Then she appeared. Marianne. No longer human, no longer a woman I had once known. She stood shrouded in shadows, her body twisted. Half-formed, half-decayed, patches of rotting skin peeling away to reveal sinew and bone, her eyes burning with a feral intelligence, wild and unrelenting. She moved with unnatural grace, a predator stalking her prey. "Holtz," she whispered, voice like broken glass scraping over stone. "You can't leave. You belong here, with us." Her words were a twisted lullaby, seeping into my mind, trying to unravel what little sanity I had left. But I raised my pistol, unflinching. "I'm ending this," I said, voice hoarse but resolute. She laughed, a sound that shattered the silence like thunder. "You can't kill what's already dead." Suddenly, the flat itself seemed to respond, walls breathing faster, veins throbbing with violent urgency. From the shadows emerged shapes, distorted figures with faces like melted wax, their limbs grotesquely elongated, eyes hollow but burning with terrible hunger. They reached for me with gnarled hands, desperate to drag me into the flesh that pulsed and writhed beneath my feet. I fired again and again, each shot tearing through a figure only to see it dissolve into a puddle of blood and bone fragments, replaced instantly by more. The flat was endless, its horrors infinite. My breaths came in ragged gasps. Blood trickled down my arm, a deep crimson river staining my sleeve, the pain a distant echo beneath the storm of adrenaline and terror. I ran, heart pounding, dodging grasping hands and snapping jaws, moving deeper into the flat's unholy guts. The walls squeezed tighter, the corridors folding and twisting, bending reality itself until I could no longer tell up from down, inside from outside. Then I saw it, the source. A pit, cavernous and bottomless, filled with a swirling blackness that seemed to consume light itself. From its center rose a figure draped in shadow, its form shifting and pulsing like living smoke. This was the heart of the flat, the hunger that devoured all who entered. I stumbled forward, weapon raised. The figure turned, eyes like burning coals fixed on me, voice like the grinding of bone. "You came willingly, Holtz. You sought your punishment." I screamed and fired. The bullet passed through the shadow and struck the pit's edge, sending ripples of dark energy coursing outward. The ground trembled, and I was thrown backward, landing hard on the fleshy floor. Pain exploded through my side, and I felt the warmth of blood pooling beneath me. The flat convulsed around me, walls cracking, flesh tearing open to reveal endless tunnels of raw muscle and exposed nerves. From the pit, a tendril of darkness shot out, wrapping around my leg like a serpent's coil, dragging me closer to the void. I fought with everything left, kicking, punching, clawing at the living flesh that pulled me in. Then I remembered Marianne's blouse, the photograph, the faces pressed into the floor, the souls trapped here, crying out for release. With trembling hands, I grabbed a shard of bone protruding from the wall, jagged and sharp. I drove it into the tendril, tearing through the shadow with a sickening sound like tearing fabric. The darkness recoiled, releasing me just as I scrambled to my feet. I looked up, sweat and blood dripping down my face, and took a final breath. This ends now. I raised the pistol one last time and fired straight into the pit's heart. The shot echoed through the flat like a cannon blast, and the darkness screamed, a sound of 1,000 tormented souls being ripped free. The walls convulsed violently, flesh and bone peeling away like rotten wallpaper, revealing cold stone beneath. The flat shuddered, then began to collapse. I ran, stumbling through crumbling halls, dodging falling beams and walls that dissolved into dust. Light flooded in from a shattered window, a beacon in the nightmare. I burst out into the fresh air, lungs burning, heart racing. Behind me, the flat groaned one last time before settling into silence. I was free. But the flat had changed me. It had carved itself into my mind, into my bones. And I knew, even as I stood there gasping in the daylight, that some part of me would never leave. If you found this, if you're reading what I've written, then know this. You're stepping into darkness far deeper than you can imagine. This place, this flat, it's no ordinary building. It feeds on fear, on guilt, on everything you try to bury inside. It will pull you in, tear you apart, mind, body, and soul. I barely escaped with what's left of me, I don't know if you will. If you value your sanity, your life, turn back now. Some doors should never be opened. Some stories should never be told.